Welcome to this breakfast meeting with the background in the European crisis. As a background, we are asking the question, is Europe a community of values? This event is co-hosted by the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation and Civita. My name is Eilev Hegstad and I will moderate today. So this breakfast meeting will be held in the following way. First, all three panelists will have the opportunity for some introductory remarks. They will then get the chance to respond to each other before I open up for questions from the audience. So if you have questions, then let me know by raising your hand when the time comes. I will mention this again later on in the meeting. The meeting will end at 9:15. If you haven't realized by now, the meeting will be held in English. But first, I will give the word to Gabriel Baumann, who is the head of the Nordic office for the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation.
Good morning, and also very warm welcome from my side from the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation to our joint breakfast seminar with Civita. My name is Gabriele Baumann, as it was already said, and I have the honor to be the representative of the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation in Stockholm, covering all 5 Nordic countries. For those who do not know yet the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation, we are a German foundation and a think tank close to the Christian Democratic Union in Germany with state-funded 120 branches worldwide. We offer in the region roundtable discussions, conferences and seminars, and also do issue publications on European politics and international affairs. And this also includes the discussion about European values, center-right policy, and Christian democracy in Northern Europe. Related to this, we have been working together with Civita, together with Eilev, on an anthology about Christian democracy in Europe, which will soon be published and available for purchase. So Eilev, who is our today's moderator, as he is the editor, he will say a few words about this later as well. Civita has been a long-term partner for our foundation in Stockholm, and I would like to take also the opportunity to thank Lars, Peder, Mathilde and Eilev for a very good and an excellent cooperation. This morning we talk about the lessons we can learn from the legacy of European politicians, of Konrad-Adenauer, Robert Schuman and Alcide de Gasperi, just as one examples. So we take it from history, and then we think about how we can shape and defend the European community of values in the light of permanent disruption and aggression from Russia and China. And as you said earlier, Eilev, we are in a crisis situation right now with a major war, major war in Europe. And of course, Russia is trying to destroy our European security order. And this community of values we are trying to have, trying to get and hold together. So a lot of topics we have to discuss, as I said, coming from history towards the actual situation we have in Europe right now. And I wish you a good and fruitful discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. We'll now turn to the panelists, and the first speaker is Michael Borchard, head of Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung's Archive for Christian Democratic Policy. Please.
Thank you. If I were a Brit or an American, I would now start with some funny kind of anecdote, but as a more or less boring German, I stick to the very cruel German habit of the preliminary remark. And the first remark would be that we are neighbors in Berlin. Now I see the question mark on your faces. If you ever happen to be in Berlin, and if you take the bus line 100 across Berlin, which leads you to all the attractions, there will be a bus stop, and the bus stop is named Nordic Embassy's Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung. So that means we are close to each other because, of course, a very important part of the Nordic embassies is the Embassy of Norway within that building. So I just wanted to tell you this. And the second rather somewhat unpleasant confession is that this is my first day in Oslo and in your beautiful country. So many thanks for the invitation. At first glance, it seems kind of strange what I'm doing here, being a representative of a German political foundation, which is close to the German Christian Democratic Party, but financed by the state, by the German state. That's a very special kind of thing in Germany. And I'm here in Norway talking about the European Union in a country that is not a member of the European Union, yet very much attached to the European Union. But I think if you look deeper, this has a very actual meaning. And let me directly, because I think my role is to be a little bit the history guy at the table, let me directly switch over to those people already had been named, Adenauer, Alcide de Gasperi and others. The parents of the European unification process had a very strong motivation for their policy, which can be summarized in the motto, war, never again. Certainly not on European soil. So the experience of not only two brutal wars, the devastating experience, but also the destruction of every kind of value, and we are talking about values today, I think that was what was really bothering them. Values that have been trampled, especially by Germany in the years before 1945. I don't want to claim that the situation in which we are right now is really comparably, even remotely comparably to what shook Europe back then. But all of us, I think it's fair to say, could hardly have imagined just 10 years ago that less than 1,600 kilometers from Oslo and less than 1,200 kilometers from Berlin, we have a bloody war of aggression, again raging, with one country seeking to annex large parts of another country. The fact that we in Europe have become so accustomed to this seemingly eternal kind of peace, that looks like the Russian Secret Service here, with one country. So the fact that we in Europe have now become so accustomed to this seemingly kind of eternal peace can also be viewed positively, because it is undoubtedly showing that, and has to do with the fact that European unification and what we in Germany called Westbindung after the war have fulfilled their function. The fact that the longing for peace, for the protection of human rights, that democracy and the rule of law together are at the top of so many Eurobarometer surveys, far ahead of social solidarity, which also includes financial compensation, is a clear sign that Europeans really appreciate Europe as a community of values and culture. The European unification project, even for those countries like Norway that do not belong to the EU but are very close to it, has without any doubt brought the level of security and cooperation that should make us appreciate what great statesmen like Robert Schuman, the Italian Christian Democrat Alcide de Gasperi, Jean Monnet, the name has to be named as well, Konrad-Adenauer have achieved with their Christian democratic movements that created a common basis of trust from the very first meetings within the framework of the transnational party cooperation of the Nouvelle Equipe. This has to be named too. From the very beginning, the CDU has pursued, the German Christian Democratic Party has pursued the claim of being the German party, but also of being the political factor in Europe that represents the idea of European unification with a very clear emphasis. In the German concentration camps and prisons, but also on the European battlefields, the idea was also born with Christian democratic parties all over Europe after the time of ideologies that had so characterized the whole first half of the century. Now man, his personhood derived from the godlikeness, the inalienable dignity, the capacity for freedom, the responsibility in the center, freedom connected to responsibility. All these very important foundations of the Christian democracy have been very important for Adenauer, who had also the feeling that the interconfessionality, Catholics and Protestants together within the CDU, which was very important for the Christian Democrats as well as especially in German because he thought that they didn't enough join forces against the National Socialists. In Europe, Christian democracy blossomed as a countermodel to the ideological parties, not only in Germany, but precisely there, the party landscape before the National Socialists seized power and before the Second World War was more polarized than ever before. The fact that we in Europe have become so the other idea besides this super confessional idea, which has been established also by Adenauer and the Christian Democrats, was the idea to combine this super confessional idea with the idea of the people's parties. And I think that's also a very important historical event. These two ideas, the worldview based on the Christian image of man, which prohibits any totalitarian, that's a very difficult word in English, totalitarianism in itself, and its combination with the idea of an integrating people's party. That's what the historian Jan Werner Müller called the most important political innovation of the post-war period and one of the central ideas of the 20th century in general. I believe that to this day we have placed too little emphasis on 2 points that arise from the Christian conception of man and that constitute the highly topical core of this political idea. Even in our challenging times, Christian democracy is not an extension of the churches, but the values, especially the strong connection between freedom and responsibility that can be derived from the Christian image of man, are not exclusive but inclusive. And also acceptable for those who do not belong to the Christian faith or who do not believe at all. And secondly, where I respect man in his individuality and God's image with the Christian image of man, there can be no longer any absolutism of a leader or ideology. The basic Christian democratic idea is profoundly anti-totalitarian. We can debate this later, but I think if we would have led the discussion about the European Constitution in another way, it was more about Christian values. I think we should have had the discussion about anti-totalitarianism. If we would have framed this discussion more in that direction, I think we would have had another discussion. I will be closing soon for Konrad-Adenauer, and that's a second big thing that I would like to name before I end. Totalitarianism is also included in what he himself always called somewhat abbreviated materialism. And this is another element that has been the success of the Christian Democrats in the process of European unification in 2 directions. The idea that has now made it to all the relevant treaties of the European Union, the idea of the so-called third way between capitalism and socialism, namely the way of social market economy, in which the freedom of competition is not restricted as far as possible, but in which a reliable framework is set with clear rules and with an incentive-based regulatory policy that prevents market excesses. The social market economy is, if you will, the economic policy expression of the Christian conception of man. And the second idea that is connected with this idea of economic integration, and here I think we should a little bit come back to this idea, the economic integration and interdependence. When we look at the EU today, we sometimes tend to overlook the birth cell of the European Union, in which, like in a human cell, all the genes were already laid down. The European Coal and Steel Community, which was founded 70 years ago as the world's first supranational association dealing with energy, dealing with the resources that we all need, but dealing with it in a way that everybody has the same access to these material to ensure balanced access. In this way, I think the process of European unification has become inseparably linked not only with securing peace, but also with securing prosperity in Europe. And I think that's a very important point. Both were also extremely important to the second great German Christian Democrat and European, and being the deputy chairman of the Helmut Kohl Foundation in Germany, I have to name his name, Helmut Kohl, who viewed things with the same mixture of value orientation and pragmatism like Adenauer did. This became even more relevant with reunification and with the fall of the Iron Curtain. With admission of the young democracies from East Central Europe, he was concerned as a contribution to securing peace to make European unification irreversible once and for all, Europe was to become once again a community of values and culture characterized by diversity. In accordance with this motto, that German unity and European unification were two sides of the same coin, this was one of his quotas that he always used, that an economic and then also monetary union would not alone reduce fears of a resurgent Germany, but could benefit all Europeans and bring lasting peace to the European continent. But there's a final thing that I would like to name here when it comes to the values. And you know that Helmut Kohl was a former prime minister of a German state. For him, a guiding principle was the idea of subsidiarity and the commitment to federal structures. I think this is an element where we should occasionally also should remind the European Commission of today when making some decisions. And that's my now very final short remark. We have, after all the good news that I gave to you now, maybe some of two examples maybe of bad news, where I think that the Commission is not really taking care of this kind of subsidiarity. One example, as right and inevitable as it was to consider constitutional proceedings against Poland and Hungary in the event of violations of the basic principles of the treaties, it is also important to reflect that beyond these populist governments, it is becoming increasingly apparent among the population as a whole in these countries that there is kind of an uneasy feeling when it comes to Europe. The self-image of these countries and their peoples is that they have fought for freedom, for Europe, at considerable sacrifice, and have sought membership of the EU, in the EU, primarily in order to be able to enjoy greater prosperity, but rather to be able to act freely in a clear legal area after years of domination. In these countries, there are fine antennas for the feeling of paternalism. It is precisely in this case that the value of subsidiarity is of paramount importance. However, not always, admittedly, also in dealing with the consequences of the corona crisis, the Commission, which is under Christian democratic leadership, admittedly, resisted the temptation, not always resisted the temptation to want to regulate centrally, after all, what should be regulated in the countries. For example, Mrs. von der Leyen's strict stipulation of climate neutrality by 2050 surely is justified, but has been perceived in these countries as very prescriptive. As much as crises need powerful solutions, a more Europe, a deepening, a more deep kind of Europe can ultimately only be achieved with a strict application of the principle of subsidiarity. And we can only preach the rule of law on Sundays if we also observe it on weekdays. Again, one example, the fact that only 4 members of the monetary union feel bound by the new debt limit of 3%, and that politicians like Bruno Le Maire regard the debt limit as obsolete, undermines the rule of law, and thus also the values of the union. Despite all the huge difficulties, complexities, and imperfection on the EU, almost exactly 10 years ago, Helmut Kohl said a thought-provoking sentence, and I would like to conclude with this sentence: there is no responsible alternative to the policy of European unification. If we want to secure peace, freedom, security, and prosperity for all the citizens of our continent in the long term, then it remains our task to work with commitment and optimism to build the house of Europe, because Europe, and this is especially true for the young generation, is our future.
Thank you for those introductory remarks. We now go to the second speaker, Janne Haaland Matlary, who is Professor of International Politics at University of Oslo. Please.
Thank you very much. And this is very familiar ideas that you presented. I was a member of the Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace in the Vatican for 17 years. So we have looked at what we call the social doctrine of the Church, which was derived from these ideas, really, and the German Christian democracy really came out of the beginning of the workers' movement for the fight for workers' rights in Germany and one reflected on the universality of not only human rights but rights to vote. So this is familiar terrain for me, and I tried to introduce it to the Norwegian Christian Democratic Party quite some years ago, but it was that was an uphill battle, to put it bluntly. I would like to do two things. I want to say something about the current war and values. Is this a war about over values, basically? Is it at heart a war over values? But then I would like to also reflect on the commonality of European values, because in times of crisis we discover that we have indeed there's something fundamental in our societies that we take for granted most of the time when we don't have to defend it or reflect on it. And I've written a book called The Crisis of Democracy, or The Slow Death of Democracy, The New Intolerance, which was published in Norwegian last year, where I have a chapter on exactly this, how, to what extent can we say that there's a European commonality of values. And democracy, of course, is marked by pluralism, disagreement, permanent dissent, permanent disagreement. This is the sort of mark of nobility of democracy, to be in disagreement. I disagree with you completely. How refreshing, how interesting, how good isn't this? There's even a book by an American lawyer, Cass Sunstein, professor of jurisprudence, which is entitled the need for dissent, or the society of dissent, because dissent makes democracy work. Conformity is the worst enemy of democracy. And I think this is really very important, that pluralism, permanent disagreement, in a way, that the lack of conformity should inform democracy and is vital to its continuation. And this derives deeply from the European values tradition, or the history of individuality in our civilization. And just some very few stepping stones in this development. Often we talk about the Judeo-Christian tradition, or the antiquity, modernity tradition, and some have said that European history of ideas is a sort of series of footnotes on either Aristotle or Nietzsche. Nietzsche being then the nihilist, relativist, nothing is firm, nothing is objectively to be determined as a human right or as a human nature. Whereas Aristotle and the Aristotelian tradition, which has dominated most of the centuries, one could say, being absorbed completely by the Christians, Thomas Aquinas in the 12th century, sort of in a nutshell, the definition of the human being in Aristotle, Plato, and the Greeks is that the human being is a social animal. It's like other animals, like my two dogs. They're very social. You live in a flock, in a community, in a family, in a society by nature. So you're social, but you're also rational. And rationality doesn't mean only that I can discern that this is a table and this is a chair and that 2 and 2 make 4. It doesn't mean only my logical sense or my empirical sense of observation and perception. It also entails ethical discernment, that the human being is able to know in his heart or her heart that it's wrong to stab your neighbor, or it's wrong to murder, it's wrong to steal, and so on. And indeed, this is what the Socratic dialogues are all about. Socrates asking people without any education, a young boy, for instance, to reason, to use his faculties of reason. And this crystallized into the tradition of virtues and vice, of character formation, education, that the Romans loved so much and the Greeks developed. And this is about cultivating your virtues, your ability for magnanimity, for goodness, for truth, for courage, for discernment, all the virtues, and suppress and fight your inclination, which is also natural, for doing bad, for bad choices, for the vices. And in Norwegian we have a good expression, å ligge under for lastene. You're not yourself, you're not in command of yourself if you just follow all your inclinations. So this character formation program is continued in the Christian schools, starting in the Roman Empire, Benedict and so on, universities developed in Europe, and we call it natural law. But it's basically has nothing to do with Christianity as such, but the church is a key to promote it. And St. Thomas Aquinas in the 12th century, he rediscovers Aristotle, which is, in a way, has had a long detour in the Middle East. So it's Muslim philosophers, Averroes, and so on, that bring him back to Europe. So Aristotle is rediscovered at a time when you had to handwrite your books, copy your books. Thomas, who is then professor at the University of Paris, adds to this edifice simply the Christian virtues of faith and caritas. This specifically Christian view of nestekjærlighet, of caritas, of selfless love as an ideal. Now this relates to then this development of a consciousness that we have rights, we have obligations, we are free individuals as human beings. We are not. It's not the power of the Lord or the fyrst or the king that determines our very lives. We have rights against the power of the state or of the Lord who lords over us. Worldly power is not the only power. So religious freedom, for instance, is developed very early in the 1566 in today's Romania, Turda, the diet of Turda. It isn't a diet of food. The diet of worms sounds even worse, but the diet of Turda is the place where religious freedom is developed among the various Christian churches in what was then the Habsburg monarchy. And the idea was to have some kind of tolerance among different groups. This then grows into democratic demands for power, for voting rights much later. Democracy comes much later after the sense of, should one say, individual responsibility and rights is developing in Europe. French Revolution and onwards, a fight for working class or marginalized people's rights. So I think we can say that, maybe we could say that in Europe we assume, rightly so, that when somebody has power over us, it is because we have given them a mandate for wielding such power. So we can always ask, why should you determine anything on my behalf if you don't have a mandate? And this is, of course, part of the whole subsidiarity debate. And I agree with you that in the EU there is very much almost usurpation of power on the part of the EU Commission in these questions of family policy versus Poland and Hungary and so on. We don't have time to go into that, but just keep in mind this. We assume that we are free individuals responsible for our own lives and choices. We have an ethical compass which could be cultivated and should be. We are not serfs. We are not, we are not born under some power. We decide to give power to representative government, and I think it's good to remind ourselves of this when we look at the war and on Russia, because clearly in Russia there is no such sort of instinctive reaction to the power of the state. The state is sort of all-powerful, and if you question that, if you discuss that, if you say by which mandate do you wield this power, there is going to be a harsh response. So in a way, the lack of this individualistic Western, we could say in terms of history it's a Western tradition, but of course the values we speak about as human rights, grounded in natural law basically, they are adopted as universal rights when the UN was founded. So the UN Pact of Charter and the Charter of Human Rights of 48, also at the UN, and the Geneva Conventions, they all reflect this sort of the inherent rights of the human being by virtue of being a human being. So this is something that all states in the world are bound by if they are UN members, because this is not a kind of treaty-based rights that you have to sign on to. You accept certain principles, the principles of the UN Charter, when you're a member of the UN. Now there was a lot of controversy over the UN Declaration of Human Rights, Eleanor Roosevelt's work back in 1948. And the Soviet Union at the time and the satellites of Eastern Europe, they took objection to and abstained partially on the declaration because of its stipulation of the inherent rights of the human being. Also Saudi Arabia abstained because there was an equality for divorce rights in it. Man and woman are equal in agreeing to get married and in agreeing to dissolve a marriage. So this equality of men and women in marriage was not recognized by Saudi Arabia. So already at the time, this was controversial, and this became much more controversial in the 70s when one developed legally binding human rights treaties on civil rights, the classical liberal rights, but also on economic and social rights, which was partially a compromise with states that are very much against any kind of limitation on sovereignty, on their non-intervention sort of rights as the state. And this is where we are brought to the present. China, for instance, objected extremely heavily to the Norwegian Nobel Committee's granting of the prize to Liu Xiaobo in 2010, because we were saying, or they were saying, the Nobel Committee, that there is such a thing as freedom of expression for a person, not granted by the Chinese state or in Chinese positive law. So both Russia and China would be wary of this kind of intervention and this kind of criticism, as we know quite a lot about. This is a sort of recurring theme. The West says human rights are violated, and these states say, no, we respect all human rights, but we have Russian or Chinese or Iranian law defining what human rights are. And that's the core of the problem, because what the Western tradition says is that I and you and all of you, we are born with human rights against the power of the state. The state's power is limited by human rights that are naturally given us by virtue of being human beings. And the other states that disagree with this and that are non-democratic for that reason will say, no, sovereignty is total. What happens inside our territory is what we decide can happen here. Nobody can intervene. Now, it seems then paradoxical that such states do intervene in other states, as we saw now in Ukraine. And that, I think, has very little to do with values. It has to do with Russian imperialism and Russian views of Ukraine and so on and so forth. So when we say that, in a way, when we're trying to analyze this, we must be aware that the value, should one say not the value, but the rule. We talk about the rules-based international order all the time. It's an American, not very elegant expression. rules-based, because there are always rules. I mean, there are rules in China and rules in Russia and rules everywhere, because social interaction requires rules. But what is meant by this expression is really the UN Charter and the Geneva Conventions, primarily and secondarily. And primarily it's the prohibition to intervene in another state by military means in a war of aggression. That is basically put to attack another state without any plausible reason, without any casus belli. And the UN Charter regulates this, prohibits this kind of action by one state against another for the first time in human history. So that's something to remember. This is fairly new in human history, that it's prohibited to attack for no obvious reason. So there have been hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of such aggressive wars, of course. And I see that I will be ousted from the chamber soon if I keep on. So let me end on this by saying that why has the West reacted to this war of aggression? Well, I think it is the explanation is not to be sought in values. It's not the violation of the Geneva Conventions that is the cause, because they were known to us much later in Borchard and so on. It is the blatant violation on this scale, because Crimea happened 2015, did not elicit this kind of response, was a much smaller aggrandizement, but it was the same principle that was violated. So this is explained by the magnitude of it, by the implications for extended deterrence, China, Taiwan as a key word, the role of the US in the world if this were let to pass, and by American leadership alone. No Europeans would muster this coalition of weapons delivery, taking the risk that that entails, had not the US been the leader in this coalition. So this doesn't fit, in a way, the bill of being we act on our values. But now that we're in the action, so to speak, we see the importance of this for our values. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. So the third and final speaker is Ine Eriksen Søreide, Member of Parliament for the Conservative Party, Høyre, and former Foreign Minister. Please.
Thank you very much. Well, as the active politician in this panel, I will try to grasp some of what you have said and transform it into what we see on the global and European scale today of what, so to say, a community of values, whether we are or not. I think it's wise to just zoom out a little bit at the outset to just look at how this is now perceived globally, what the situation is when it comes to these basic rights and values that you have both been talking about. I think it's fair to say that much of the picture that we're seeing is moving a bit in the wrong direction. More people are living under authoritarian rule. There are more countries who define themselves, or at least their leaders, as authoritarian. And in addition to that, a new twist, in a way, has emerged, and that is that many of these leaders are now elected through normal elections. They do not seize power in a coup, for instance, as they used to do. They seize power through normal elections. And then they use their term in office to tighten the grip around the basic rules and values that we are discussing here today. So that means that it's more legitimate in a way than it used to be, because you can always say that, well, people elected me. Secondly, there is a trend right now where many of these authoritarian states are using the platforms that we have been using all along to try to expand the human rights, to try to make more of these basic values universal, to do the reverse thing, namely to water down the human rights, to try to make them more relative in a way and not universal. Typically, you have China, Russia, and others who try to shape the narrative of the human rights into their picture, saying, for instance, that there is a ranking between different rights. So that freedom of expression, for instance, or freedom of belief is no more valued than your right to have a roof over your head or food on the table. Which, of course, was not the point with these universal rights, who, as Janne also said, are inherent because we're human beings. And that is a challenge which, in my opinion, is growing at the moment, because we put the individual at the center of these rights, where many of these states put the state at the center of these rights. So that is, in a way, the big challenge, and this is done, I would say, covert and overt. What is usually happening is that many of these states are trying to change just small pieces of the wording in a text, for instance, in a paragraph, which can then have enormous implications 5 years down the road. The third point I wanted to make on the global issue, which has a direct bearing for the war in Ukraine, is that we are now very focused on what I think is a very, very good European unity on pushing back against Russia. But if we look outside of Europe, the unity is not that strong. We have a tendency to focus on, when we see, for instance, voting patterns in the UN General Assembly, we focus on the 4 countries in addition to Russia that supported Russia's claims. What we should focus, and we focus on the 144 states who opposed, what we should focus on is the 32 states that abstained, and the reason why they did so, and also which countries they are. Many of them are populous countries, they are powerful countries, and of course they have a possibility to exert influence on other countries. Meaning what we're about to see is more of a division, I would say, between different countries and different groups of countries globally, where you see a clear Russian outreach to African countries, for instance, because they want to keep them inside of or under their wings to make sure that they support them. Because I think Russia realizes that Europe is a lost case in a way for Russia. But this is really a development that we have to follow very closely, because that is maybe the most kind of dramatic thing about the voting patterns and the situation globally today. The question and how to put this into a European context. Well, it's important to be aware of these kind of global trends. And the question that was asked at the outset, is Europe a community of values, or is Europe more than a free market area? And I would say, yes, definitely we are. I say that also because we have seen, not only historically, as we have gotten a very good outline of here, but also right now during the 2 last crises that Europe has faced, the pandemic and the war in Ukraine, that we are able to gather around some basic values. But at the same time, there are some clouds on the horizon. One, of course, is that many of these rights we have been used to take for granted, because the trajectory that we've all been on has been moving towards more freedom, more democracy, more human rights, and we have not really taken into account that this very clear development can halt at one point, and it has to a certain extent. And I think it is fair to remind ourselves that many of these rights that we see as very basic, they are not always put to work by all states. The processes that we have had from Norway's side, for instance, against both Poland and Hungary on basic values connected to the EEA grants, has been quite illustrating in that sense, and we can get into that later on if you want to. But I want to add one interesting thing that I see as a pattern on the EU side, whereas some argue that the breaches of, for instance, Article 7 or others from Poland or Hungary has to do basically with human rights, which, yes, is absolutely on the agenda. The EU also argues that if you undermine the rule of law and the judiciary, you also undermine the free market and the single market, because you will not have trust in a judiciary and by that you will not have the same ability to operate within a free market. So it's an interesting way of discussing. I was part of a high-level reflection group to discuss where the Council of Europe should go next. And of course, that is a discussion that was quite, well, you can say a lot about those discussions, and many have been taking place before. There will be a new summit in May. But what I think has been important in that discussion is to try to also make the Council of Europe not discuss all the other issues that could be interesting for the Council of Europe, but to stick to what it should do, namely preserve the basic human rights, the basic values of democracy, human rights, and rule of law. And by that, you have to prioritize and take away many other issues that are also interesting to discuss. But at this time, right now, that is maybe the most important thing that the Council of Europe can do, and to reaffirm those values at the summit coming up in May. And then, of course, again, without Russia, since Russia has been excluded. My two final points on the situation and how it's seen and perceived is that there is also one challenge, I think, for the European side right now, and that is especially what happens with the Western Balkans. And the Western Balkans are in essence, very fragile, very vulnerable, both the economic development, people's aspirations to having a job, having an education, having a good life. And the EU has, and also Norway and others, have been talking about how to include the Western Balkans. And in my opinion, it is a very dangerous path if you open up a path to, for instance, an EU membership. You never start the accession talks, and you ask these countries to do a lot of very necessary reforms. The governments take a political risk doing so, but their populations will soon see that, well, if this doesn't lead anywhere, why should we do all these reforms? And that is where Russia, Saudi Arabia, China, Iran comes in to fill that void and to exert more influence on these countries, which makes it more difficult at the next stage to actually include them. And my last point is that, as I alluded to, I think Putin sees Europe as a lost case when it comes to cooperation and values. And that has, of course, many reasons. But bear in mind that one of the biggest fears of a regime like Putin's is for democracy to flourish in its neighboring countries. So if we look back to 2014 and the annexation of Crimea, what actually caused much of the turmoil that eventually led to this annexation was Ukraine's signing of an association agreement with the EU, which made this a very definite step towards a more Western-leaning Ukraine. For Russia to see that was, of course, dangerous, for one reason, because they could not exert the same kind of influence over their so-called near abroad and the former Soviet republics. But of course, it's also very dangerous for Russian people, or in Putin's mind, for Russian people to see that democracy, freedom, economic growth is possible with a different rule. So it's, in a way, an existential threat to his rule or to authoritarian leaders' rule. And that is also why I think these discussions on democracy and why it is so important that we uphold these basic values and rights is a point to be made also when it comes to dealing with the war. So I'll stop there and leave some room for questions and comments.
Right. Thank you very much to all the three panelists. I kind of interpreted that you all basically said yes to the question, is Europe a community of values? We're in with Christian democratic values, human rights, etc. I think I'll give you the opportunity to preferably briefly respond to each other's comments, but I also wanted to pose a question that you could also try to answer. I think that, to my mind at least, we have thought, or Europeans have thought, that our values are shared, or at least will be shared by the whole world. It's just a matter of time. Do you think we have to reevaluate this narrative? And if so, what should replace it? So Janne, you want to start?
Yes, I wanted to comment on something Ine said at the end there, which is the core of this connection between the war and values, or the value of democracy, but also the conundrum, the problem here. And that is you mentioned that the successful democracies in a neighboring country to Russia is a threat, and it's often called the Rose Revolutions in the Russian version of it. And I think this is very true. This is where the threat is. Because if you are an authoritarian ruler, if you're in power and you're not really elected and could not face a true democratic contestation for power, then you will try to preserve your power by suppressing dissent, of course. So that's entirely rational. But if your neighboring country, which you think of as an underdog in all ways, chooses the democratic way and is able to flourish doing so, and starting then going towards the EU, even NATO, then you have to stop that, because that becomes a threat. And the conundrum, the problem in a way for us, is that human rights universally recognized as a concept, but as you said, practiced in very different ways. One of the human rights is in the Declaration of 48 is, for instance, the right to free and fair and secretive elections, which implies democracy. It doesn't say democracy, but it talks about the right to elect your leaders, political leaders. And in the UN system, in UN text and so on, there is no obligation for all states in the world to become democratic. One doesn't talk about democracy as such at the UN. One talks about good governance, which is a euphemism, can mean many things. And we have had some rounds of sort of promotion of democracy under Bush. You remember the Bush Junior presidency, linking, in a way, weapons. We should promote democracy in his sort of take on it to the Middle East and so on, with muscular means if necessary. But we also have our own, should one say, Western sort of very, very controversial and therefore so important version of this, namely responsibility to protect, which is this doctrine adopted politically but not legally at the UN in 2005, which says that if a ruler massacres or attacks his own population, his own subjects, or his own citizens, not subjects, but they may be subjects to him, then there's a duty to intervene, humanitarian intervention, or responsibility to intervene with political means, with economic means, with persuasion, but also perhaps with military means. So this whole doctrine of helping those that are attacked in grievous ways is so controversial because it represents intervention by mostly Western powers. And Libya is the prime example of this in a UN resolution. And this is resented so much by Russia, China, Mexico. When I was in office, we were developing this, and I traveled around to get support for the UN Security Council place for Norway in 2000. And I remember Mexico saying, "What is this? You're promoting this responsibility to intervene in other states." So here we are at the core, sensitive. We can't sort of doctor other countries on the inside too much, but we nonetheless are obliged in a way to promote human rights. We don't say like realists, like the Mersheimers of this world. We don't say, it's okay, you do what you like inside your state, and you accept what we do. We will never interfere in your sort of political dealings inside your state. This is a type of sovereignty that is old-fashioned. It's the original Westphalian model. Today, it's no longer tenable. So I think this comes down to how wise and how powerful the West will be in this contestation, which is very clear between democracies and rather non-democratic regimes.
Michael, and then Ina, and then if anybody wants to ask a question, you can raise your hand now, and I'll try to write it down. Okay.
When it comes to the history of connections between Europe and Russia, there's one thing I would like to bring to the table. We in Germany followed very much, but not only we in Germany, the notion of Wandel durch Handel. So we change this big Russia and the way they are dealing with the international global politics in a way that we drag them deeper into trade, into economic connection and cooperation. And then they will kind of turn and they will kind of be a different kind of state, and there will be more liberty and whatever. And that was naive, we have to say. But that is also bringing the question to the table. Isn't that somewhat similar to what we want within Europe? And there's, I think, the big difference. The big difference is between cooperation, which is more loose, and connection. And this is why I really brought the European Coal and Steel Commission to the table, because this is really the intertwining of the economies, the supranational kind of body. And this is, I think, if we talk about values, we also have to talk about this kind of edifice, this house that we built, which is a very, very clear, stable house. So I think that, and this is very important what you said about the Western Balkans. I totally agree to you that we can not offer to these states who are not yet members of the European Union, if you do this and that, in the end, maybe there will be then the accession to the European Union. But we should kind of speed up these processes. Because I think it's very important then to bring the final goal to them. And of course, I was saying that prosperity is not everything. But the mixture of values on the one hand, freedom, peace, but also prosperity is very important. And there has to be a payoff in the end for these countries. I'm also quite sure, and I know that this will be maybe very much disputed in this room here, Helmut Kohl was very much in favor of dragging Turkey into the European Union. You can dispute this very, very much, and I have to admit that I thought it was a wrong idea. But he said if we kind of really give them a very clear perspective of being a member, and if we don't push that to a very far end, maybe they will then change. There's only one question mark I would like to raise is if you look at the development of Erdogan. Erdogan and his AKP, they have been member of the EPP, associate member of the EPP. And the very early Erdogan was a very different Erdogan from the one we have now. So once again, I'm not advocating any kind of naiveness, and I'm not saying that Putin developed the way he developed because we did everything wrong and we didn't offer enough to him, and all these discussions that we have very much in Germany. But I think we should use these dynamics. What we are doing is postponing, it's very complicated, and of course everything is complicated, but not to give a very clear perspective to these states, especially to those states who really do belong to this European community like the Western Balkans. Not to forget the Baltic states. They are members of the European Union, but when it comes to security policy, to the way how we deal with the Russians, they are directly, let's say, at the front to Russia. And they don't understand the way we discuss in Germany. They feel the threat immediately that could, in a way, happen to them if there's not enough deterrence against Russia.
Okay, Ina, and then we'll go to questions, and then you can respond later. I have one question so far over here, so I'm sure there are more. So raise your hand, Ina.
Just very shortly. In my opinion, we have been doing too much wishful thinking on Russia for too long. We have never really understood or read the signals. In a way, we have misread Russia and its intentions. I mean, it's really not been a lack of engagement. I mean, look at, as one example, we used, Jan and I meet on a daily basis nowadays on different conferences, but yesterday we used as an example as well, the strategic concept of NATO from 2010 lists Russia as a strategic partner to NATO. There was the establishment of the NATO-Russia Council. There has been engagement with the EU, there has been engagement in trade, and as one of the participants yesterday said, previously or up until now, the establishments of gas pipelines between countries were seen as an act of brotherhood. Now is seen as an act of naivety, and it's really something that has changed the perception. I do not think, however, that our mental maps are totally I would say in lockstep with the developments on the ground, because I still hear people saying that, well, the relationship with Russia will come back to some sort of normality again. I do not think it will, and there are good reasons for that. But I do think that we have to understand that in our thinking after the end of the Cold War, it was a very clear mantra that if we only engaged Russia enough, they would become like us. Yeah. And they are not. And that has to do also with values and how we perceive this. Your question on, or your statement that the Europeans have thought that our values are shared by everyone or will be shared by everyone, I think we've seen over some time now a certain pushback to that narrative. We have, in my opinion, a joint responsibility, at least on the European side, to lead in this matter, to make sure that human rights and freedoms are not watered out in the UN, for instance. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't have discussions with countries that have a different opinion from us. But I think we have to be very mindful of the fact that many countries are now effectively capable of changing and altering the basic human rights by their powers, for instance, in the UN, and we have to be aware of that.
Okay, so we have two questions, one behind there, and then one in the front.
My name is Janne Haaland. A question especially to Janne Matlary. To my opinion is it must be possible to combine Christian, social, family values with a liberal state, like independent courts, freedom of speech, freedom of the press. And I think this difference is very important when it comes to the different opinion about what is happening in Poland and Hungary.
Yes, thank you.
We'll take another question.
Okay,
and then we'll
good.
Sorry.
Thank you. My name is Odd Gunnar Skagestad. I got one question for, well, I almost said two Norwegian members of the panel, but I think that all three panelists would be able to have some meaningful opinions on this. The Norwegian foreign policy through the past 70 years, or at least through the past 50 years, has been a policy based on values, almost entirely value-based. So it was met with some surprise back in 2008. The government issued a white paper with the word interests in its name, in the title. Now that passed quite quickly. It appeared that the Norwegian interests are actually its values. So that's a part of what I call the Norwegian exceptionalism. I think it was Lord Palmerston, the British Prime Minister, who said that the state has no friends, only interests. I don't think he mentioned anything about the values. But what we see now in Western Europe especially is, at least the way I see it, is a merging of values and interests. What other people call the European communality of values. That's quite surprising and quite new in world history. And I think it's a very fragile construction, actually. So what's your opinion about the durability of this combined values and interest situation that we see now? Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. we're going towards the end of our meeting, so I think if all the panel can answer the questions and have some concluding remarks as well, if you have them. I think we'll start with Janne, since you got a question specifically for you, and then we'll go Mikael and Ina again. Yes.
Thanks. Two very good questions. On the Poland-Hungary EU, and it's not the EU so much as the European Parliament, which is not always very representative of anything really. Of course, there is no legal competence for the EP to, for instance, have a resolution on abortion rights criticizing Poland, because it's not within the remit or the competence of such a body to define abortion rights for a nation state. Nonetheless, the European Parliament did exactly that in a resolution a year and a half ago, saying that we declare human right to abortion, for instance, which is nonsense, because there is no human right to abortion in any treaty, and it's up to nation states to decide an abortion policy, which Poland does and many disagree with. But also the European Court in Strasbourg has never ruled on abortion rights as a supranational human right. So this is an intensely contested field where there is so much difference of opinion, which in a way is the hallmark of democracy. But it's up to Poland to define. And then, of course, to define whether one has a Christian character for the nation, which Hungary has in its constitution, and Norway also in paragraph 2 of our constitution. Christian values and human values underlie the state, something like this in an English translation, paragraph 2. That is also contested, of course, but it's fully possible to have such a determination of who you are in the world. If we look at the Strasbourg Court's verdict on Italy back in 2003, I think it was, Italy versus Finnish, Lautsi, Finnish mother, who contested the crucifixes in schools that you find also in bars everywhere in Italy. So, I mean, this is a prime example of where subsidiarity is a key criterion, because you should make decisions close to home if possible, and subsidiarity is a doctrine of decentralization, distribution of power between the levels, nation, regional, or local, regional, national, and supranational. Skagestad's a very good question. There is a legitimation of all that we do almost, especially when we use military force in value terms, so-called humanitarian. Why are we in this or that operation internationally? Well, the UN asked us to do so, which is a really lame and unacceptable answer, because the UN will always ask you to contribute to any operation where you might possibly, cough up some soldiers. But it's the easy way to say the UN, and if there's a UN mandate, there's no discussion whatsoever, although there was an attempt when we had the Iraq war and the Kosovo war. But the general gist of this value-based argument, of course, is that nobody is against values, especially good values that always are presented. So then there is very little discussion. There's no sharpness of analysis either, because you're not weighing interests against each other. There's no prioritization. And of course, the one that observes this will see that small states have a tremendous interest in a sovereignty norm that excludes aggressive war. So if we have an interest in this business of the Ukraine war now, it is to make sure it succeeds on with the Western help for Ukraine, so that the norm of non-intervention is strengthened and not weakened. So I think this is something we should talk much more about. And as a political scientist, we analyze national interests. And as the Brits are die-hard realists at heart, as Palmersson's quote underlines. But clearly, a lot of these, the values of democratic publics being able to determine the fate of their country, to choose to go for EU membership or NATO membership and so on, is at the core of this, where the interest and the values coincide. But I am a great fan of our analytical tool of speaking of national interests. What are the national interests? And that's useful when we look at this coalition. What's the French national interest? What's the German? To what extent, in a way, can Germany overcome, a public that is very skeptical of the use of force and so on? So this is I think values is a term that is so unspecified that it's almost unusable, because we should talk about rules perhaps and principles and interests.
Michael, and then Ina, preferably short.
Yeah, I'm trying to be very, very short. I think if you look at the very important, also Christian democratic leaders in Europe in the history, they have always been great pragmatists, but equally great idealists. So it was the combination of the two strains. And I think what is really important about these people is, and maybe also about, let's say, the Christian democratic approach, is that the Christian democratic approach is rather to work with incentives when it comes to politics than with forbidding things. So I think the personal freedom and the combination of the personal freedom but the responsibility on the other side, so to say, the personal freedom and responsibility against paternalism. And you can also transport this on the high level of politics. I think that it is very important that we come back to this kind of notion of, let's say, really discuss these values in a combination of values on the one side, but also national interest. And if you look at Germany, and I can only talk about Germany, we lost absolutely the capacity and the ability to formulate national interests. For the last, I would say, 20 years, we were so much obsessed with also being within Europe more the moderate factor. So we lost a little bit the ability to formulate our own national interests. And I think this is very important now to again see that a country like Germany has, of course, national interests, but within the framework of the values of Europe, within also the frameworks that we are firmly being attached to.
Ina.
Thank you. Just very shortly on your very good question at the outset. In 2019, we presented a white paper to Parliament on Norway's interests and role in the multilateral system. And very shortly, for the sake of time, we defined as our primary foreign policy interest to uphold the system of international law. And for a small state like ours, that's extremely important, as Janne mentioned. And we see it very clearly today that when you do not do that, might comes before right. And the signal you send to authoritarian leaders that we talked about in the beginning is that there are no rules. You can do exactly what you want. You can intimidate, you can bully, you can annex, you can invade, because it doesn't have any consequences. And if no one really kind of takes the fight for international law, it will crumble. And that was the reason why we sought a term at the Security Council as well. It's not because we thought that we could turn the Security Council around. It was because we as a small state also need to shoulder the responsibility of actually upholding these international norms. And that was the reason why. So I think it's fair to say that we have defined our primary foreign policy interest And I think for a country like ours, it's quite obvious that it should be upholding international law. Then my second and final point is this. If you look at what is happening today on the rules-based order, international human rights and so forth, it is a very clear tendency that no one today in their right mind would dare to open a convention again. Because the risk is we would never, I mean, today we would never have agreed on many of the convention that guides our human rights work, for instance. But if you open them again today, in the sake of trying to expand them or include more rights or so, it is a real risk that you would end up eroding them instead. Because all the factors I mentioned earlier would then be strong enough, potentially, to actually alter and change these rights. And it's a really, it's a bit of a sad development, I would have to say. But my final sentence is that when I was foreign minister, I had never, ever imagined that I would spend more time trying to defend what we had already agreed on compared to moving forward. And I was not alone in this. I mean, my European colleagues and others felt exactly the same. And I sincerely hope, again, that Europe can lead on this, not by alienating other countries, but trying to find some common ground that we can agree on when we move forward.
Thank you. As was mentioned at the beginning by Gabriel Baumann, Civita and the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung is working on an anthology on Christian democracy that will be out at the end of May at the Scandinavian University Press, Universitetsforlaget. If you're interested in this or other events, then follow, go to Civita's website or Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung's website. Lastly, just join me in giving a hand of applause to the panelists, and thank you for an interesting debate.